It's 6 a.m. one cold winter morning, and an occupational psychologist is running to catch a flight to the patent office in Munich. When she lands, she spends the next 8 hours in a room with 30 patent officers shuffling cards around a table, trying to figure out what makes a great patent officer. And as you can imagine, everyone had their own opinions, and most of those were different.
Trying to get 20 or 30 people to coalesce around that, who didn't really understand what the qualities on the cards were in the first place, had very different opinions, and kind of to my earlier point with hiring managers always believing they know the job, had their individual biases, was a difficult exercise that I'm not really sure got us to a good outcome.
That occupational psychologist was Kate Young, who is now head of people science at Sapia.ai. And she's about to explain why AI can now do the same work as an 8-hour, 30-person international flight exercise in 90 minutes from a laptop with better data.
But Kate isn't here to tell you that AI is going to replace your hiring process or your hiring team. She's here to explain why most businesses are making hiring decisions on fundamentally broken data and why the fix is a lot simpler than you think.
You have to measure what matters, which is the right competencies or skills for the role, whatever language we prefer. But then you have to ask the right questions that are going to feel fair and inclusive and give everybody the right opportunity to demonstrate their skills. So the AI enables this in a very clear way because it consumes the competencies we've agreed on. We've chatted about, we've swapped some out. We're all happy, and then it's going to combine that data with the job description that is really clear about what's required in the job to come up with some really tailored questions that are explicitly linked to the competencies.
Hello and welcome to Truth, Lies and Work, the award-winning podcast where behavioural science meets workplace culture, brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. My name is Leanne, I'm a chartered occupational psychologist.
My name is Al, and I'm a business owner.
And we are here to help you simplify the science of work.
Kate Young has spent her career in hiring science, from traditional psychometrics at some of the biggest consultancies to leading the people science team at Sapia.ai. Sapia are a pioneer in ethical AI for hiring. They're known for bringing rigorous people science and strong AI governance into recruitment at scale. They've helped brands like Costa Coffee, BT Group and Holland & Barrett to design fair, explainable hiring systems that are grounded in structured interview science. Now, Kate made the switch into AI hiring because she saw the field moving fast and believed that without occupational psychologists in the room, it was going to go very wrong very quickly.
I have to admit, I was a little sceptical, but after this conversation, I actually think Kate's right. After this very quick break, we'll find out why your job descriptions are probably lying to you, what extroversion has to do with bias, and why the candidate who gets ghosted might actually be getting a fairer deal with AI than they've ever got before. Don't go anywhere.
I'm Kate Young. I'm an occupational psychologist by background. I'm currently head of people science at Sapia.ai. It's a fancy way of saying lead psychologist. Sapia are an AI hiring firm, and I've been there around a year. Previously, my career was mainly in the more kind of traditional hiring space, some of the bigger consultancies or leadership assessment firms in more traditional hiring solutions and psychometrics. And then I made the switch over into AI hiring about a year ago because the market and the field was moving so fast, and I firmly believed that occupational psychologists need a place in that conversation if it's to be done right, and if that industry isn't going to run away with lots of kind of technologists in their garages churning out CV screening solutions that, perhaps aren't the best. So in terms of what I'm famous for, I think the last year it's really talking a lot about that and how we make AI in hiring valid, fair and defensible.
And I think we've already got some people kind of shifting in their seats just by mentioning AI and hiring in the same kind of sentence there. And we're going to get into all of it. But I want to start at the beginning and not assume that people will know what we're talking about, because some of these terms are very much in our world. So in terms of job analysis, what is it? Why does it matter?
Right. So job analysis, it's quite an old process. It's probably been around 30 or 40 years at least, if not predating this kind of Second World War, is the process by which you define the duties, responsibilities, tasks, behaviours and skills that are necessary for successful performance in a job. So a typical output might be a list of what does somebody actually do all day in this job? When they sit at their desk, what are their tasks? Or when they walk into their shop, what are their responsibilities? And then once you know what they're doing, what behaviours or qualities they need to perform that effectively. So it might be a skill like planning, Sometimes a job analysis includes something like a values or a motivation type statement. So this person must be highly energetic. Now, you and I as psychologists might have kind of feelings about that as something we should be assessing against, but sometimes that's an output. So traditionally, a job analysis would be this, quite hefty document that would be the result of many hours of focus groups, surveys, interviews with job holders, line managers, HR to really understand what does this person do and what do they need to do it.
Is it something that is still relevant in a world that seems to be faster paced and we can ask ChatGPT to write a job description for us? Is it a dying art? Is that a problem? Where do we stand with it today?
I think it's even more relevant, but you're right to challenge on the pace part. Because there are so many choices out there in how you hire. Everybody knows what a CV is and an interview is, and there's been around for donkey's years. And some people will know what an assessment centre is. So where you go and there's lots of people there, and you might be observing a group discussion, for example, or you might do a role play. And most people have heard of personality tests or ability tests. So maybe you have to answer some questions about numerical reasoning. There's lots and lots of choices in how we assess. But assessing someone fairly and correctly really comes down to measuring what matters. So actually making sure we're measuring the right things. And the only way we can do that is a job analysis. So with so much, honestly, bewildering choice of how you assess out there, if we're not even getting the basics right, the basics of job analysis, then we're almost sort of doubling down on the error. We're measuring the wrong things, then we might make the wrong tool choices, and then we'll get the wrong outcomes, which is potentially the wrong people for the job. And worse than that, people are unhappy in their jobs because they haven't been selected into a role that fulfills them.
What does an organisation gain by going through this detailed process to then figure out how to assess people within that recruitment process? Because a lot of businesses will just screen resumes and maybe go to interview, maybe they'll do a work sample test. Are we just overcomplicating it as psychologists?
It's a really fair challenge, and the answer is always it depends when you ask a psychologist any question, because the necessity of job analysis, what do they gain? Do they have to do it? Isn't a straight yes, no. How high stakes is the role? How complicated is the role? How known is the role? Is it a new role? Arguably, roles are newer and more confusing and more complex than they have been with the kind of pace of organisational change. We're defining new jobs almost every day, whereas if we perhaps look at the retail and hospitality sectors, it's not that we don't understand what those people do every day and what we need to hire for. There, the job analysis, I think, is playing an even more important role in reducing bias. So although hiring managers will typically have a really strong predisposition for what they want to hire for, there's going to be layers of human bias all bundled up in that. So by going through the robust job analysis process and asking what do these people actually do and what do they actually need to perform it, you pull out all of that bias. And so the outcome for an organisation is a less biased hiring process, and employees who will stay longer in the role perform better and be happier. Which is
solving an expensive problem, isn't it? I think I've certainly worked with clients who have been frustrated that they're hiring people in, they only stay a few months and they move on. But investing this time up front does feel like a lot, particularly when, everything right now, isn't it? The climate that we're in, the state of the world, the state of the economy. Is this where AI can come in and make it more time effective, make it more cost effective? Is that something that Sapia is doing?
100%. It is absolutely hugely time consuming. I'll share with you my kind of favourite job analysis story from days gone by. It was pre-pandemic, so probably about 2016. My alarm had failed to go off that morning, which was helpful when catching a 6 a.m. flight to Munich. So I was rushed onto the plane to catch the flight to Germany to go and work in the patent office there to identify what makes a really great patent officer. This is a fascinating role to work with, actually, because in patent offices, you need people who are highly, highly specialised in their role. They're deep, deep technical experts. very, very well qualified, but they're also really happy to sit in a room all day on their own reading documents. So to try and identify the type of people who are going to excel in that role, who aren't going to leave because they're bored, or in fact they had issues with depression and anxiety in that role, is really critical. But the exercise itself was immensely painful, even setting aside my lack of sleep and kind of airport panic, because I was in a room for 8 hours, or it felt like 8 hours. It may have only been 4 or 5, with kind of 6 or 7 patent officers. And there were another kind of 20 patent officers that had been beamed into this sort of presence technology. It was like fancy advanced video conferencing. So I was trying to corral sort of 20 to 30 highly paid stakeholders into, we had cards, and the cards had qualities on them, and you kind of had to swap the cards in and out according to how important you thought the qualities for the job were. So trying to get 20 or 30 people to coalesce around that, who didn't really understand what the qualities on the cards were in the first place, had very different opinions, and kind of to my earlier point with hiring managers always believing they know the job, had their individual biases, was a difficult exercise that I'm not really sure got us to a good outcome. And I think the reasons for that are many. Too many stakeholders. When you do a traditional job analysis process, suddenly, everybody hears it's going on, a focus group interview, I want to go, I've got an opinion, I want to be involved. And there's no kind of structure. It's hard to bring in structural discipline to the process when you're facilitating all those human conversations. Whereas what AI does is, rather than having to lock 25 people in a room for 6 or 7 hours, or doing lots of focus groups or interviews over a series of days, is it condenses that process through bringing in data at the start. So what Sapia have done is built a tool called Job Analyzer Studio. Now, this tool sits on top of a competency framework. For listeners who may not know, a competency framework is a list of, we can also call it skills, soft skills, so things like planning, negotiating, strategic thinking, learning agility, those types of soft skills that we're all familiar in the workplace. We have 25 of them, which are well defined, because we analysed 37,000 job descriptions to get to them. So the tool knows the relationship between tasks performed on a job and the behaviours or the competencies required to undertake those well. So what it can do is consume a job description to make an initial suggestion, which is data-driven. These are the behaviours that are likely to lead to success in that job. And then that's when you get into the question of, where do you bring humans into that process? And because we've basically done the first 90% of the work through using AI to support doing all that work that otherwise would have been shifting cards around a room, you get something to review and agree with, disagree with, or challenge. So your conversation becomes incredibly productive, because you're just doing the parts that a human really needs to review. So I can get through that process in about 90 minutes now, which is much lower use of organisational resource. And of course, it can be fully remote, on Zoom, time zone agnostic. So I believe it's a massive step forward in job analysis to be able to use AI.
So just so I understand the process, you bring a job description to the AI application, and then that job description would be analysed and would pull out the competencies that it has learned is most effective or most predictive of future job performance.
Effectively, yes. There's a bit more in that. So I will spend time up front asking questions beyond a job description, and job descriptions really vary in quality. If you've ever seen any, or even had to write any, they can be excellent and they can be awful. So if there's any gaps in it, we need to spend time plugging those, and we have a conversation about typically do a kind of, it's like the old rep grid technique, which is where you'd say, think of 2 employees, one who you really rate and one who you don't. Like, I make it that simple for people, and I say, tell me why, what John does better than Barry in this situation, and we'll go through some quite simple probing, but just going through some very simple questions in about 20 or 30 minutes added to the job description gets you enough information for the AI to make a really congruent recommendation.
And in terms of the development of the AI, because things I have heard or read or seen people talk about on LinkedIn, seen people talk about, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
is things like, well, AI is biased because it's learning from information that's already biased. So how do you and Sapia ensure that as an AI application, it is supporting ethics and trying to remove bias from that part of the process?
So in the case of job analysis, there's a few different steps. With AI, any AI system, not just limited to hiring, it comes back to the data you put in, garbage out. I think we've all heard that phrase. So the job descriptions were very much cleaned, curated and interrogated for bias that we fed into the system. So, and we can all, I've seen job descriptions that say things like, talented in all areas of life, may demonstrate this through sports outside of work, which is horrifically ableist language, in fact. Or they'll say words like dynamic or highly go-getting, words that would tend to lean more towards how majority groups tend to show up in the workplace. So we cleaned up all of that before ingesting these job descriptions. So the data itself was as clean and unbiased as it possibly could be. And then the other way is this human in the loop. So once we've ingested all the information, we sit there and we review it and we interrogate it for bias. So a good example, one we always get to is extroversion. So people who are energetic and chatty, they do well in lots of roles. And they're also more likable. And I say that as an introvert. Extroverts tend to we tend to be drawn to them more. And so a really interesting flag is when kind of extroversion comes through as something that we want to measure against, because then I'm kind of going to turn around and ask the question and say, well, does this person actually need to be giving out energy to others all day? And if they're on a shop floor selling cosmetics, for example, yes, they absolutely do. If they're sitting in an office, then what would probably happen is we've got a little kind of bias towards perhaps likability that's crept in there. So there's that interrogational layer as well. So it's really the data you put in and the interrogation layer that pull everything out at the job analysis stage.
I'm a client of yours. I've gone through this process with you. We created the job description. We've gone through the Sapia's done its thing. It's popped out the competencies that we need. What happens next? What do I do with that?
So next there's another stage. So we've got the competencies. Then we make questions, and that's an equally critical part, because you have to measure what matters, which is the right competencies or skills for the role, whatever language we prefer. But then you have to ask the right questions that are going to feel fair and inclusive and give everybody the right opportunity to demonstrate their skills. So the AI enables this in a very clear way, because it consumes the competencies we've agreed on. We've chatted about, we've swapped some out. We're all happy, and then it's going to combine that data with the job description that is really clear about what's required in the job to come up with some really tailored questions that are explicitly linked to the competencies. And it's also trained to do really neat things like balance the questions. So from an inclusion perspective, from making hiring fair, we know that some types of candidates respond badly to questions about, imagine it's your first day in the job and the till has broken. Some people don't like to do that kind of abstraction. They can't do it. Whereas if we ask questions, tell me about a time when you had a leadership role, for example, we know that candidates who are more advantaged in life are more likely to be able to share those examples. So the AI is quite clever, and it balances those types of questions as well in its final recommendation. So all I'd say in terms of what happened next, you get your questions, and those questions are pushed into this chat interview product that we have. And the chat interview is these 5 questions we've come up with the mix and the balance that candidates interact with via their laptop, tablet, phone. They answer the questions in their own time. So there'll be preamble, welcome to your interview with such and such, and we wish you luck and please be yourself. And there's little prompts as you go through, like, oh, Leanne, you've done 3 questions, you've only got 2 more to go. Keep going, and there's kind of a thank you and feedback at the end.
So this is a chat, I don't want to say bot, application that is leading this interview with candidates.
So we're really clear it's not a chatbot. And the reason I make that distinction is chatbots are normally dynamic, in that if I say something, the chatbot's going to give a different response based on what I said. And that might be scripted, or it might be based on a large language model. So it might be a bit cleverer than that and alter its response, like having a conversation with ChatGPT. Ours doesn't do that. It gives the same questions to every candidate. And the reason is because we are very passionate about fairness and inclusion in hiring, and one of the best ways to achieve that is to make sure everyone gets the same questions. And it's our view that conversational AI, that dynamic AI, hasn't reached the standard yet where we would be happy to deploy it to candidates. So we keep it all the same for everyone.
But it is an automated system that's presenting the questions to candidates.
Yes.
And candidates presumably are aware of this, that it's of what's happening in that process.
Yes. They log in and they'll get an interview, some text explaining, and then they'll see the first question appear. And it appears like your message does on your iPhone. So you see the 3 dots, and then the message loads. So it's very clear it's not a human being. It's an automated digital experience.
And is this typically the first stage of the recruitment process?
Yes, we typically are. We say kind of top of funnel. So we usually look to replace either the CV. We don't like CVs. They're horrible ways of predicting how someone will perform in a job. They're riddled with bias. So where we can, we like to replace the CV and bring the chat interview in at that stage.
So if you're not looking at CVs, how do candidates get shortlisted for this initial interview stage?
They don't need to be shortlisted. There's a great strapline of my CEOs is everyone gets an interview. And you apply and you move straight through to the chat interview. And then the shortlisting happens after that based on your performance in the chat interview.
I'm having all sorts of thoughts on that. I would imagine as a candidate, that's a really positive experience to go through, because it's so soul destroying, isn't it? When you're applying for so many roles and never hear back and never get any further and get the chance to even demonstrate what you're capable of. I like that. And are you finding that candidates are responding well to that?
It's incredibly positive. So our candidate satisfaction is around 9.10 across all clients. We ask for free text feedback. We ask people to write a comment. We just did a massive analysis. I say we, the data science team did it. I didn't do it because they took thousands of words of text and went through them to pull out themes, and they were overwhelmingly positive. I think the one that always stands out for me is candidates get a chance to feel they can tell their story because it's untimed, because they're typing, and because their CV wasn't rejected, because a CV is a list of things we did. It's not our story. It's not our words. It's not us reflecting on our experience. So it's incredibly positive for candidates, and clients do report that pretty much universally.
And candidate experience is not something that is thought of very often or scores very highly for many, many organisations, is it? That's incredible, that rate of candidate satisfaction you're getting.
It's exceptional, and something I realised coming into this job, because I think, I'm often accused of being almost too much of a scientist at times and being obsessed with the science of solutions. So I kind of used to underrate candidate experience, but what I was really forced to reflect upon in this role is candidate experience is candidate trust. And if candidates don't trust a hiring experience, they're not going to engage with it fully, give full responses, show their true selves, and be able to kind of demonstrate their skills to the best of their potential. So the experience itself is making the hiring decision more robust because candidates are fully engaged with it.
Yeah, and again, as well as you say, in terms of fairness, that type of process allows for people to think and reflect, doesn't it? It doesn't put time pressure on it. Which, yeah, I'm thinking my nephew is dyspraxic and he is incredibly intelligent and empathetic and talented, but you need to give him space to communicate that. So I can imagine that will work really well for neurodiverse candidates as well.
It really does, and it's something I'm actually really proud of. My own daughter was diagnosed as autistic last year, so I think a lot about how she'll experience applying for roles. And we track this data. We're data obsessed, as you might expect from an AI company, and we find our satisfaction rates for either neurodiverse candidates or candidates who identify as having another disability typically comparable, maybe 0.1 smaller sometimes, just because hiring is always going to feel a little bit harder for neurodiverse candidates, but they're more or less comparable and really positive feedback themes.
That's exceptional. Wow.
It is.
Wow. Okay, so I'm thinking now, because I can hear Al in my ear as like the business owner going, ask this, think about this. I imagine he'd be sitting there going, wait a minute. Candidates all go through to an interview that they can type or speak into with no time limit. How do I know that's them? How do I know they've not got their mate or their parent filling it out? How do I not know they're asking ChatGPT? How do you check for the authenticity of who it is you're actually interviewing?
It's a really important question, and it's a question that's not unique to an AI chat interview. We've had, I would call it unprompted, unsupervised hiring methods for years, sort of personality tests, cognitive ability tests, those types of things that candidates will do with no supervision whatsoever. And we've always just had to trust it's them. And unless we're going to proctor to supervise every candidate, which given the volume of applicants to jobs now is impossible, we have to accept I believe we absolutely have to accept some level of risk. Like there are proctoring solutions out there where you switch on your camera and you're being kind of watched. It's not something we're willing to explore because we value that trust with the candidate and that inclusion, and being filmed by camera is the opposite of an inclusive and comfortable experience. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. So we're choosing to prioritise that candidate experience and trust over absolutely knowing it's not their mum doing it. There's a lot of prompts and nudges in there around making sure it is them. So if we detect they're using AI-generated content, and we stop them copying and pasting anyway. So if they're going to use ChatGPT, they've then got to type it all over, and you introduce that friction just will discourage a lot of people. And then if we detect they're doing it, they get a nudge like, look, we think you might be using AI content. Please don't do that. We need to see your responses and your truth. So, and if they do it again, they get prompted again. Typically, most people stop after that prompt. They don't do it. So, yeah, I can't do anything if they get their mum to do it. But by and large, because they enjoy the experience and they trust it, I think those rates are going to be pretty low compared to other solutions.
Okay, so what happens next? I'm really enjoying this, kind of going through the journey like as a candidate and thinking like as the client as well. So I've done this interview. What happens then with the data? What happens with the client? How do they get notified? What happens next?
Oh, well, how nerdy do you want me to get?
Very, please.
Very nerdy. Okay, so in terms of data, the data is their 5 chat interview responses. And this is really, really important because when we talk about AI in hiring, people will go to certain well-known lawsuits and they'll assume that, for example, my name, Kate, which is clearly a kind of female-leaning name, is going to go in there and it's going to tell the AI algorithm that I'm a woman and that's going to bias it. So we are super, super clear that the data is those 5 responses. They're consumed by a scoring model. So it's a scoring model, you can call it like a prompting framework. And I kind of like to think of this as something that's holding the hand of your large language model. So we use Claude. All your listeners will have heard of ChatGPT. That's the most popular one. Claude's just like another one. It has the best privacy settings. That's why we choose Claude and some other things. And it's holding the hand of Claude and saying, okay, Claude, we need to score this candidate's response. Imagine you are an expert occupational psychologist trained in all these principles. This is all the things I need you to consider. This is what you're scoring against. This is how you check you're getting it right. If you get it wrong, this is how you correct yourself. This is what counts as evidence. This is what doesn't count as evidence. And it'll go through that and it'll make it do it 3 times. And then it's going to give scores. So I mentioned these competencies before. So you get a 1 to 5 score for each competency. And then they're pulled through into reports. So more importantly than the score, and the score is what will be used to help effectively rank the candidates. So hiring managers can start to identify the ones they want to move through to whatever their next stage is, typically a telephone or a face-to-face interview. But what you're getting is one of those scores, a lot of explanation. So when we think about AI hiring and AI governance, explainability is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Where you get a lot of fear in AI hiring is what we call black boxes. So data in, something comes out, no one understands how it got there. Of course, I'm not going to trust that. Why would I? Whereas with our model, the hiring manager will get a report that explains exactly how that 4 out of 5 or whatever's arrived at. So I'm giving Leanne a 4 out of 5 for teamwork because she's told me an example of how she motivated a team when they were under pressure. And in question 3, she told me about how she comforted a team member in a specific scenario, and it will connect A to B repeatedly. So the hiring managers can have real trust in that. And also they can query it if they want to as well, because nothing's hidden.
And what's the threshold to pass as such in terms of the next stage? Is that individualized by the client or the role, or is it kind of like a set benchmark?
We don't do automated pass-fail. We give back a score to clients. And it's depending how many people they need to move through to the next stage will define where they tend to set their benchmark. But typically, because of the types of roles we're hiring for, the client's going to be applying a couple of other filters as well. So if we're thinking about retail, they're going to also just do some filtering for people who are available to work Saturdays and so on and so forth. They meet some other criteria. So they're going to do some filtering and they're going to rank the candidates and they're going to work through those from kind of top to bottom and start moving them through to interview. But the actual number they'll move through from kind of that first stage to second stage varies massively across client, just depending on their hiring needs.
So I'm also seeing at this point, hiring managers are quite happy because the first that obviously I've been involved in the job analysis and checking those competencies, but the first that I am then, in terms of my time, dealing with is candidates that have been screened, that I've got lots of nice information for, that I can filter for different criteria that I want, and then I go on to, you say, the face-to-face, the telephone interview stages. Is that what you're hearing, or are hiring managers a little bit distrustful of the AI that's happened and decisions that have been made without them?
Well, hiring managers are not a homogenous group. It would make my job a lot easier if they were. By and large, hiring managers are delighted because their time to hire, which is what most of them are targeted on, is going down as much as 70 to 80%, especially for high volume clients. And they are finally released from the tyranny of CV screening, which nobody enjoys. There's a little bit of novelty when you first start. My first role was as a recruiter. I was terrible at it because there was too much sales involved. And I used to find it really fun going through every CVs and going, oh, that person's put a picture on. That's ridiculous. But then the novelty kind of wears off because you're just trying to make decisions with rubbish data and repetitive data. So they're released from that. Their time to hire improves. Their quality of hire improves. But yeah, there are absolutely people who are reluctant to trust. And then that becomes a job for us to, run the analysis, prove it's working, and kind of hold the client's hand through that change management piece. And typically where we struggle most is where there's an easy alternative for the hiring manager. So again, in something like shops or retail, walk-ins, where people walk in and say, I really want to work here. That's really compelling for a hiring manager, like somebody's bothered to travel to the store, make themselves smart, walk up, shake their hand and say, I really want to work here. Can I interview? So that's usually our kind of big tension point is pulling people away from that and into the AI hiring tool.
What's to stop a hiring manager filtering for, I'd only want to employ women, I only want to employ men, I don't want anybody who's neurodiverse, I don't want, is there any way to prevent that? Or once that data is back with the client, it's theirs to do with what they see fit?
So none of that data exists as filterable in our system. We collect, are you male, female, what's your ethnic group, only for anonymized background monitoring, so we can check the system's fair. Ultimately, I can't stop a hiring manager if they've met two candidates and one's a man and one's a woman and they really wanted to hire a woman. I can't stop them making that decision, and nor should I really, because the decision, the tool doesn't exist to make the decision, exist to provide the best possible information. So the decision sits with the hiring manager, and that's another kind of really important principle around AI and hiring and accountability. You've got to be really clear what decisions sit with the humans, what decisions sit with the AI, what sit with me as the psychologist, what sit with the hiring manager as the person doing the job.
And if I'm recruiting for a role, and I know this is going to be a massive depends, but let's say I'm hiring for a role that typically in traditional recruitment might get 500 applications. Through this system, how many candidates am I likely to pop out with at the end, where then we'd take them to kind of second stage of that recruitment process?
Oh, that is a massive it depends, because
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how is this in change what businesses or hiring managers might be used to? Am I getting far less candidates through? Am I getting maybe 4 or 5? Am I getting hundreds that I need to go through? And I understand it's going to be depending on the role but I guess I'm wondering if there's a typical kind of outcome that hiring managers are going to get when they're faced with people who've gone through that competency interview.
Sure. So if you want a typical outcome, we generally we do sort of give a yes, maybe, no label and that's purely based on score. And that is to help busy hiring managers if they're making decisions at pace. And if they've already established their trust in the tool, so like, you know what, I know Sapia assesses well, I know the score's robust, I'm going to trust the tool, I'm going to interview the people Sapia recommends. And we'd usually look to be about 30 to 40% yeses. So we'd be saying, you should probably review these people now. A lot of hiring managers won't do that. They'll go top down. They'll start with the best scores and just work down. But yeah, that's typically the kind of reduction rate.
And in terms of, again, going back to that candidate side of it and the experience, will all candidates get notified if they're not successful? How does that work in terms of the hiring manager's role versus Sapia's role?
So that's not Sapia's role because the decision, it doesn't sit with us. So what Sapia will do for candidates is everybody will get feedback. So it's a really nice, it's called My Insights. It's actually a lovely report because it's very kind of coach-based, very conversational, quite informal, and it aims to really give the candidate a sense of their strengths, but also a tip at the end. So, when thinking about future job roles, maybe consider structuring your day or something like that. So there's never that ghosting. Sapia makes socks. They're lovely socks. They're very warm. If you see them at a conference, do grab a pair. And one of them just says no ghosting on the foot of it. So they never get ghosted. They always get feedback from a Sapia side. But in terms of how clients choose to notify candidates, that very much sits with them. That said, we're really passionate about candidate experience, and we work with clients to set these experiences up. So typically we will have that conversation with them. How are you planning to communicate to candidates? What's your messaging? And offer them that support.
Who are the clients that you're primarily working with at the moment? Are they larger businesses?
Yeah, so we sell to enterprise, and the reason for that is it is an AI hiring solution. So there's kind of a governance and a setup layer, which a small business isn't going to have the architecture for yet. Maybe in the future when this is more kind of normalized, and we're able to kind of democratize the tech further. So, for example, we work with Holland & Barrett in the UK, which we all know, where we get our vitamins and our tasty, healthy protein bars. They're a really good example. Also Costa Coffee. I'm not a salesperson, so I always forget who I'm allowed to mention and not. But those are two very strong examples in the UK. And then within Australia, because we're actually headquartered out of Australia, we have a very strong relationship with Kmart, which are their sort of main big kind of retail store. They were recently featured on the Josh Bersin podcast talking about how they'd increased the efficiency of the experience with Sapia.
And I guess I'll be honest, Kate, right? As you're going through the process, I'm loving it. It's everything that I was taught and everything that I've done with clients. And I'm also thinking, well, I'm redundant then, because if AI can do all that, they're not going to need an occupational psychologist to do it. So now I'm thinking, is there a future where Sapia would maybe, I don't know, license this software to other practitioners to use with clients if we get to the point where small businesses have that structure? What's the future with it in terms of its growth and application?
I'm not sure we've been asked the licensing question. I can't see why we wouldn't. But I'd also want to say it's definitely not making us redundant. I did a workshop last week at the Division of Occupational Psychology conference over in Cardiff. It's a beautiful city, wonderful conference. And the workshop explored what is our role as psychologists within an AI hiring system. And really the takeaway is we're just moving from individualized hands-on judgment and ad hoc review to a very sort of systemized role. So we're designing the architecture, the governance, the parameters that need to sit within a system to make sure it's working well and it's fair and it's unbiased. So it's like many things. Is AI going to make me redundant? Absolutely not. It's just going to make your job more interesting because you can do more of that elevated, interesting problem solving. What is the future? So I think for us, what we want to do is take everything we're learning through chat interviews and all the intelligence we're building around competencies and use that to sort of leverage it more from a talent intelligence perspective. So not just for hiring, but also to support things like internal mobility. So where you're kind of collecting all of this rich data up front about someone, make it work for them as they travel through the organization when you're thinking about internal roles or perhaps coaching, so on and so forth. So doing more with the data we have because it is so rich.
There might be someone listening who goes, but you're reducing somebody to a number. You're giving them a score. You're giving them a 3 or a 4 is that the right thing to do? Is that dehumanizing somebody?
It's a really fair question. And it might be a kind of overly pragmatic response, but I would always encourage anyone asking that question to say, what would you prefer? By which I mean, is it better we reduce someone to a CV that's screened in 20 seconds and you get a decision based on bad data, bored recruiter? Yes, they are given a score at the end of the interview, and yes, it is used to make a recommendation as to whether they move forward. But that score is based out of all of the robustness that I've just described, all of the great questions, all of the great principles. So ultimately, to make when you've got thousands of people in a hiring funnel, you need a piece of data to make a decision on, because there has never existed a time where all of those thousands of people would have got a lovely face-to-face interview. That's just a kind of nirvana we like to imagine that was actually never real. We used to post off CVs and hear nothing back, and it was heartbreaking because you put it in the envelope, you put the stamp and gone to the post box and you got nothing back. So yes, it's just it is a number essentially, but it's a robust and fair number. And I think in a big high volume situation, that is the very best we can do for people.
In terms of any small business listening who's like, this sounds really cool, but clearly it's not something that I can is accessible for me right now, what advice would you give them in terms of making their recruitment process more robust, more fair?
Well, the best advice for a small business is find a friendly psychologist in your network. There's a lot of really great freelancers out there who will happily. And the thing about psychologists, I'm sure you've experienced this, Leanne. We just care so much about getting it right and being fair. So most will just give 30 minutes an hour. It's a bit like your free appointment with the solicitor. Everyone always talks about, it's kind of free. Most psychologists will give that little bit of advice. And it's kind of the Pareto principle. You can almost get 80% of the gain with 20% of the effort just by doing even rudimentary job analysis. So simply prompting people sit down and go, what does this person actually do? Don't think about who you like, think about what they do. And then looking at your hiring process and going, are we giving the same interview to everyone doing the same role, or are we just going off the cuff? And have we got space to maybe introduce something a bit more structured here? And then also with the final decision making process, how are we making that? Who's in the room? And how are we making sure it isn't the loudest person wins? Because we as psychologists call them wash-ups. You get everyone in the room and you say, oh, I like this and I rated this and I did that. And actually what happens there is just that, the loudest voice typically makes the decision. So there's some real low-hanging fruit that, local friendly psychologists can probably direct you to with a minimum effort. But failing that, go to Sapia.ai. We've made lots of white papers with some really good advice on there. They're definitely worth reading. There's good analysis in there, but also some really nice kind of takeaway commentary. And there's lots of kind of free webinars and resources around. Sapia do loads. I did one on inclusive hiring the other week, and they're a good free resource just to start educating yourself a little bit.
Say there's a business owner listening goes, this all sounds very nice, Kate and Leanne. I'm sure I could get in touch and find a friendly psychologist, but you've already told me how this is really manual and really expensive and takes ages. And I don't have the time for that. I need to get somebody into my business quickly. What if I just send all the CVs, put them all into ChatGPT or Claude, ask them to pick out the one that matches the job description best, and I'll interview that one and hire that one? Could I do that?
I'd say you absolutely can do that, but the cost of doing that is so much more than taking a beat and thinking about putting a little bit more structure and science in your process, because the cost of a bad hire, especially for a small business where they're going to be a greater percentage of your workforce, is absolutely massive. So it is absolutely worth taking a beat, upskilling yourself a little bit, thinking about some structure, thinking about some basic points of measuring what matters, and just interrogating your decision-making process. So there's loads of easy how-to guides and basics out there. Definitely go to Sapia, but there's also plenty on the rest of the internet. It's not hard to start getting some of the basics right, but it's when you kind of enter the volume hiring space that the stakes then become really high, and that's when something like Sapia is going to get involved.
I think this is really cool, and I think there's also organisations out there that other HR-based organisations, recruitment-based organisations that might feel slightly threatened by this, that are in high-volume recruitment, who might make arguments that human first is better, it's more personal, it's... How do these things coexist in a world, or do you think that high-volume is going to become AI first?
I don't think there are any high-volume processes that are still human first. Absolutely no one has got the resources. If they are, they're the clients I've spoken to in the last year who say, my recruiters are spending hours, hundreds of hours a week screening CVs. This has to stop. We can't afford it and it's not scalable. So I think, I kind of think in terms of putting some level of automation in, whether it's AI or not, but some kind of standardization at the top of funnel has kind of sailed. That ship has sailed. If you're asked if the two can coexist, absolutely, and they absolutely should. I think AI in hiring is most effective at the start, at the top of the funnel, to help you when you've got a lot of data, to synthesize that data. That's what it's really doing. It's taking all the data and synthesizing it into something consumable for hiring managers. And then at that point, the humans come in and do those face-to-face interviews. And, that could be solutions from more traditional HR providers. There are loads of wonderful providers out there who provide us online role plays or other types of exercises, and those things can absolutely coexist. And also as a psychologist, I love it when the next part of the hiring process is really different to the first part, because the chances are it's going to measure different things, as long as they're still relevant things, and you can get more information on the candidate. So everyone wins.
I have a very nerdy question that
I love it.
So you mentioned before that you gave the model all of data from job description and it popped out. How many competence did you say?
It's 25.
25. Are you looking at, maybe you already have, are you looking at, because I know places like SHL have like the standard grade 8 competencies. Are you looking at potentially, I don't know, using these 25 competencies in a way that could support smaller businesses, for example? Is that what? Yeah, tell me about that. I'm interested.
It's a great question because the competency framework itself is a great resource. And if you compare it to something like the Great 8 or Korn Ferry's Comp Framework or any other really established ones, you'll actually notice quite a lot of commonality. And that's because those frameworks, e.g. the Great 8, were also created in a really robust way. Now, they didn't use AI. They did it long before AI. So they did a relatively similar process, but manually, so less data, more time. But it was not dissimilar. So when you have robust psychologists working with similar data, you will get, outputs that are somewhat overlapping. I think we could absolutely use that competency framework to support small businesses. So one thing we've been experimenting with a little bit is just using the job analyzer tool to just help people define their face-to-face questions. So they're not going to bring in a chat interview or AI. That's not going to work for them because of the AI governance piece and the scale. But you can absolutely use the tool just to support defining your face-to-face or your first stage interviews. And that's a massive time save potentially for small businesses.
Is this public knowledge at the minute in terms of what these 25 are? Is it still kind of proprietary information? Where's that all standing?
I'm pretty sure there must be a write-up of them on our website, yes.
Ah, okay.
I should be able to name the document, but I confess I can't. But yes, it's not a secret, certainly.
If I'm listening as a potential client, how do I look into if I could use this in my business?
Definitely go to Sapia.ai. All the resources are on there. There should be a contact form on there. Anyone listening who wants to talk about the science, they're welcome to contact me either via LinkedIn. I'm Kate Young at Sapia on there. I'm not hard to find. I'm quite noisy on LinkedIn. Or kate@sapia.ai. But we love talking about this stuff and we're pretty open about it. So absolutely get in touch.
Amazing. And if listeners take away just one thing in terms of hiring better, what should it be?
I think I said it a few times, but it's measure what matters, because unless you define what you actually need to be successful in that role, it doesn't matter if you choose the best tool, the worst tool, how you execute your process. You've undone yourself from the start. So even if you can just apply some very rudimentary job analysis, that's already going to get you a big win.
That was Kate Young from Sapia.ai. And I'll be honest, I did come into this conversation like Leanne, slightly skeptical about AI in hiring. I love AI, but hiring felt like the one area where humans should probably be involved in every single stage. But now I'm starting to think we've been doing it wrong for a very long time.
I'm the same. But what I learned was that AI in this context is acting as an amplifier. So if the science and the governance is right, then AI is simply making the process faster, easier, and fairer. And Kate's point was very valid. When done right, with the support of occupational psychologists, this actually makes for a much better candidate experience. And that's something I've been pushing for a very long time.
So these are the 3 takeaways for leaders thinking about how they hire. Lee.
Number 1, your hiring process is only as good as your job analysis. I'll say that again, it bears repeating. Your hiring process is only as good as your job analysis. Before you worry about which tool to use, AI or otherwise, ask yourself, do we actually know what we're hiring for? Not the job title, not the vague list of requirements on the job description. What does this person actually do all day? And what does it take for them to do it well? If you can't answer that clearly, no tool in the world will save you.
Yes, and lesson 2, bad hiring isn't just expensive, it's unfair. Kate made this point that we've romanticised the old way. The reality was that CVs were screened in 20 seconds by someone who'd lost enthusiasm for the pile by number 6. At least AI, when it's done properly, applies the same rigour to every single candidate. If you're a small business and full AI hiring isn't accessible yet, even a 30-minute conversation with a friendly occupational psychologist, hint, hint, my co-host is one of those, can get you 80% of the gain for just 20% of the effort.
And lesson 3, the loudest voice in the room is probably the least reliable. So whether it's a hiring manager who just knows who they want or someone dominating the debrief after an interview, Kate's research is pretty clear. Unstructured decisions default to bias. You don't need an AI system to fix that. You just need some structure, some agreed criteria, and a process that stops the loudest voice from winning by default. You can find Kate and the team at Sapia.ai. There are brilliant white papers on there, free webinars, and a contact form if you want to explore whether it's right for your business. Kate is also very active on LinkedIn. Search Kate Young at Sapia and you'll find her. All the links, as always, are in the show notes.
That's all for today. So go and write down what your next hire actually needs to do, not just be. This is Truth Lies and Work. We'll see you next week.